I am Kayla Thompson, 28 years old, and 3 months ago I discovered a truth so devastating that it shattered everything I thought I knew about my childhood. For years, I lived with unexplained symptoms, dismissed concerns, and a growing suspicion that something fundamental about my medical history had been hidden from me. My parents, David and Susan Thompson, always maintained that I was a perfectly healthy child with nothing more than typical childhood ailments. They insisted that my persistent questions about certain scars, memory gaps, and recurring health issues were simply the result of an overactive imagination. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. When I finally uncovered the truth buried deep within a hospital's digital archives, the revelation didn't just change my understanding of my past. It exposed a web of deception that had shaped my entire life, damaged my health, and nearly cost me everything I held dear. Growing up in suburban Denver, Colorado, I was the middle child in what appeared to be a typical American family. My older brother Marcus was the athlete, captain of his high school football team, and later a successful physical therapist. My younger sister Emma was the academic star, valedictorian of her class, and now pursuing her PhD in biochemistry at Stanford. I occupied the undefined middle space, neither particularly athletic nor exceptionally academic, but generally healthy and unremarkable, according to family narrative. The Thompson household on Maple Street was a two-story colonial with a white picket fence, manicured lawn, and all the trappings of middle-class respectability. Dad worked as a regional manager for an insurance company, while Mom taught third grade at the local elementary school. We attended St. Michael's Catholic Church every Sunday, participated in community events, and maintained the appearance of a close-knit, loving family. But beneath this seemingly perfect exterior, there were inconsistencies that troubled me from an early age. I had vivid, fragmented memories of hospital rooms, bright lights, and medical procedures that my parents insisted were either dreams or confused recollections from when Marcus had his appendix removed when I was 5. They explained away the thin surgical scar on my abdomen as the result of a childhood accident involving our neighbor's fence, though I could never remember the supposed incident. Throughout elementary school, I struggled with unexplained fatigue, digestive issues, and periodic episodes of severe joint pain that would leave me bedridden for days. When I complained, Mom would give me children's Tylenol and assure me it was just growing pains or a mild flu. She discouraged visits to the pediatrician, claiming that doctors nowadays were too quick to run unnecessary tests and prescribe medications for normal childhood discomforts. The school nurse, Mrs. Patricia Hoffman, occasionally expressed concern about my frequent absences and pale complexion. During my sophomore year of high school, she even suggested that my parents consider consulting a specialist about what appeared to be recurring symptoms of an underlying condition. When I mentioned this conversation at dinner, Dad's jaw tightened in that familiar way that signaled the end of discussion. "Mrs. Hoffman means well," he said, cutting his steak with precise movements, "but she's not a doctor. Some children are just more sensitive than others. You're fine, Kayla. We would know if there was something seriously wrong." Mom nodded emphatically, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Your father's right, sweetheart. We've been monitoring your health very carefully since you were born. Trust us to know what's best for you." This pattern of dismissal continued throughout my teenage years. When I developed what appeared to be an autoimmune response during my junior year, causing my hands to swell and my energy levels to plummet dramatically, my parents attributed it to stress from college applications and teenage hormones. They kept me home from school for 2 weeks, treating me with over-the-counter medications and home remedies. My friend Rachel Morrison's mother, who was a registered nurse, noticed my condition when she picked me up for a study group. She quietly suggested that my symptoms warranted immediate medical attention, possibly from a rheumatologist. When I shared this recommendation with my parents, their reaction was swift and decisive. "The Morrison family has always been overly dramatic about health issues," Mom explained dismissively. "Remember when Rachel thought she had meningitis last year? It was just a headache. Some families run to the emergency room for every little thing." Dad was more direct. We don't need outsiders making medical decisions for our family, Kayla. Your mother and I have your best interests at heart. We always have. College provided some distance from their constant oversight, but the mysterious health issues persisted. At the University of Colorado Boulder, where I studied communications, I finally had access to student health services without parental interference. Dr. Jennifer Reeves, the campus physician, was immediately concerned by my medical history, or rather, the lack thereof. "You're telling me you've never had comprehensive blood work done?" she asked, reviewing the sparse medical records my parents had provided. "No allergy testing, no imaging studies, despite these recurring symptoms since childhood." I explained my parents' philosophy about avoiding unnecessary medical interventions, their belief that my issues were psychological or stress-related. Dr. Reeves listened patiently, but her expression grew increasingly troubled. "Kayla, some of the symptoms you're describing are joint pain, digestive issues, fatigue, skin problems. These could indicate a serious underlying condition that should have been diagnosed and treated years ago. I'd like to run some tests." The blood work revealed several concerning abnormalities. My inflammatory markers were elevated, suggesting chronic autoimmune activity. Certain enzyme levels indicated possible organ involvement. Dr. Reeves recommended I see specialists and obtain my complete medical records from childhood for proper evaluation. When I called home to request my medical files, my parents' response was immediate and firm. There were no significant medical records to obtain, they insisted. I had been a healthy child with only routine checkups and standard vaccinations. Any records from minor illnesses or injuries had been discarded years ago when we moved to a new filing system. "You're letting that campus doctor fill your head with unnecessary worries," Mom said during one particularly tense phone conversation. "She's probably trying to justify expensive tests that your insurance won't even cover." Dad's voice carried a warning tone when he added, "We raised 3 children successfully, Kayla. We know the difference between real medical concerns and college stress. Focus on your studies instead of imagining problems that don't exist." But Dr. Reeves's tests had revealed real abnormalities, measurable proof that something was wrong with my health. The disconnect between my parents' assertions and the medical evidence created a growing sense of unease that went beyond my physical symptoms. During winter break of my junior year, I attempted to search for my medical records independently. I called pediatrician offices in Denver, thinking perhaps my parents had simply forgotten or misremembered which doctors I had seen. Most offices told me that without more specific information, dates, doctor names, or insurance details, they couldn't locate any records for me. However, one receptionist at Denver Children's Medical Center seemed to recognize my name when I called. There was a long pause after I introduced myself, followed by a whispered conversation I couldn't quite hear. "Miss Thompson," she finally said, her voice carefully neutral, "you'll need to speak with our records department. They handle requests for older files. Let me transfer you." The records department put me on hold for nearly 20 minutes before informing me that they would need written authorization from my parents to release any information, even to me, because I had been a minor during the time period in question. When I asked my parents to provide this authorization, their reaction was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Mom became visibly agitated, her hands shaking as she insisted there were no records at Denver Children's because I had never been a patient there. Dad's calm demeanor cracked, revealing a flash of something that looked like panic before he regained his composure. "Why are you so determined to find problems that don't exist?" he demanded. "This obsession with your medical history is becoming unhealthy, Kayla. Maybe you should consider talking to a counselor about anxiety issues instead of chasing imaginary illnesses." Their vehement denial only strengthened my conviction that something significant was being hidden. But without their cooperation, and with no concrete proof that contradicted their version of events, I found myself stuck in a frustrating limbo between my own intuition and their authoritative certainty. The situation reached a breaking point during the summer before my senior year. My symptoms had worsened to the point where I could barely function. Simple tasks like climbing stairs left me exhausted, and my joint pain had become so severe that I needed prescription medication just to sleep. Dr. Reeves had referred me to several specialists, but without a complete medical history, they were essentially starting from scratch with a 21-year-old patient who should have had decades of documented care. It was during this period of deteriorating health and mounting medical bills that I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. I decided to conduct my own investigation, not just into my medical history, but into the inconsistencies and gaps that had puzzled me throughout my childhood. I began with my birth certificate, social security records, and insurance documentation, anything that might provide clues about my early medical care. I researched every hospital and clinic in the Denver area that would have been accessible to my family during my childhood. I even reached out to former neighbors and family friends, carefully probing for memories of my early health issues. Most people remembered very little, or their recollections matched my parents' version of events. But Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, who had lived next door to us until I was 10, provided a detail that stopped me cold. "Oh, you were such a brave little girl during all those hospital visits," she said warmly during a phone conversation. "I remember your mother being so worried about the surgery when you were 6. She asked me to watch Marcus and Emma several times while she stayed with you overnight." Surgery when I was 6? Overnight hospital stays? Multiple visits? None of this matched my parents' narrative of a healthy childhood with only minor ailments. When I pressed Mrs. Davidson for more details, she seemed surprised by my questions. "You don't remember? It was quite serious at the time. Your parents were very concerned about your condition. I believe it was something with your internal organs, though I don't recall the exact diagnosis." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. This conversation provided the first concrete evidence that my parents had not been truthful about my medical history, but it also raised disturbing questions about why they would hide something so significant and what other medical information might have been concealed or destroyed. Mrs. Davidson's revelation about my childhood surgery haunted me for weeks. I replayed our conversation countless times, analyzing every word, searching for additional clues in my memory that might corroborate her account. The more I thought about it, the more fragments began surfacing, disconnected images that had always felt like half-remembered dreams, but now seemed potentially real. I could almost recall the smell of antiseptic, the sensation of being wheeled down a long hallway on a gurney, and the gentle voice of a nurse telling me to count backward from 10. These memories had a different quality than my usual childhood recollections, sharper and more vivid despite their fragmented nature. Armed with this new information, I decided to approach my parents one final time before taking more drastic measures. I chose a Sunday afternoon in late August during what was supposed to be a pleasant family barbecue. Marcus had driven down from Fort Collins with his girlfriend, and Emma was visiting from California before starting her final year of graduate school. The familiar setting felt safe, surrounded by the normalcy of family conversation and the smell of Dad's famous grilled burgers. I waited until we were all seated around the patio table, relaxed and comfortable, before bringing up my conversation with Mrs. Davidson. I presented it casually, as if it were merely an interesting coincidence rather than a potential bombshell. "I was talking to Mrs. Davidson last week," I began, cutting into my burger. "She mentioned something funny about when I was little. She thought she remembered me having surgery when I was 6. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Mom's fork clattered against her plate, and Dad's hand froze halfway to his mouth. The color drained from both their faces in a way that no innocent misunderstanding could explain. "Mrs. Davidson is nearly 80, Mom said quickly, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Her memory isn't what it used to be. She's probably confusing you with one of the other neighborhood children." "That's ridiculous," Dad added, setting down his burger with deliberate care. "You never had surgery as a child. We would certainly remember something that significant." But their body language told a different story. Dad's jaw muscle was twitching in that familiar stress pattern, and Mom was fidgeting with her napkin, tearing it into small pieces. Marcus and Emma exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its source. Maybe she was thinking of when Marcus had his appendix out, Emma suggested helpfully, trying to diffuse the obvious conflict. No, I said firmly, watching my parents' faces carefully. She specifically mentioned overnight stays, multiple hospital visits, and surgery for something related to my internal organs. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad pushed back from the table abruptly, claiming he needed to check the grill, though we had finished eating 20 minutes earlier. Mom began aggressively clearing plates, her movements sharp and mechanical. "Why are you so upset about a confused old lady's memory?" she snapped, stacking plates with unnecessary force. "This obsession with finding medical problems is becoming disturbing, Kayla." That word, obsession, felt like a slap. I wasn't obsessing about medical problems. I was trying to understand why I felt sick all the time and why my own parents seemed determined to prevent me from getting proper medical care. Marcus, ever the peacemaker, tried to lighten the mood by changing the subject to his upcoming promotion, but the damage was done. The easy family atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion and resentment that made the rest of the afternoon unbearable. Later that evening, as my siblings prepared to leave, Emma pulled me aside on the front porch. Her expression was troubled, and she kept glancing toward the house as if afraid our parents might overhear. "Kayla," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure if I should." My heart rate quickened. "What is it?" She hesitated, chewing her bottom lip in a nervous habit from childhood. "When I was applying to Stanford, I needed my vaccination records for the health clearance. Mom gave me a file with all my medical documents, but when I was looking through it, I saw some papers that had your name on them." "What kind of papers?" "Hospital discharge summaries, surgical reports, prescription records. There was a lot of stuff, Kayla, way more than what you'd expect for routine childhood care." She paused, looking genuinely distressed. I asked Mom about it, and she said those papers had gotten mixed up with mine by mistake. She took them back immediately. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only did medical records exist, but Emma had actually seen them. My parents hadn't just been evasive or forgetful, they had been actively concealing substantial medical documentation. "When was this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About 3 years ago. I didn't think much of it at the time because Mom's explanation seemed reasonable. But after what happened today and the way they reacted," she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. "Did you see anything specific? Any details about what kind of treatment I had?" Emma shook her head. "I only glanced at them before Mom took them away. But there were definitely surgical reports, and I remember seeing the name of a pediatric specialist, Dr. something Rodriguez, I think." Dr. Rodriguez. Finally, a concrete lead. That night, unable to sleep, I sat at my laptop researching pediatric specialists named Rodriguez in the Denver area. I found 3 possibilities: Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Carlos Rodriguez, a pediatric gastroenterologist, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon. Given the mention of surgery and internal organs, Dr. Elena Rodriguez seemed the most likely candidate. According to her professional profile, she had been practicing pediatric surgery at Denver Children's Medical Center for over 25 years, specializing in complex abdominal procedures in children. The next morning, I called her office. When I explained that I was trying to locate medical records from when I was a child patient, the receptionist asked for basic information: my full name, date of birth, and approximate time frame of treatment. "Let me check our system," she said after I provided the details. There was a pause, followed by some typing. "Yes, I do show records for a Kayla Thompson in our database. The files indicate treatment between ages 5 and 8, with the last appointment in 2003. My breath caught. Treatment between ages 5 and 8? Multiple appointments over a 3-year period? This was far more extensive than even Mrs. Davidson had suggested. However, the receptionist continued, our notes indicate that all physical records for this patient were requested and picked up by the parents in 2004. We only have digital entries showing that treatment occurred, but no detailed information is available without the original files. The parents picked up the records? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, our log shows that David and Susan Thompson requested all materials related to their daughter's care in March 2004. This was before our full digital conversion, so once the physical files were released, we retained only basic procedural codes and dates in our system. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. My parents had deliberately retrieved my medical records and hidden them. This wasn't a case of lost paperwork or forgotten doctor's visits. This was a calculated decision to erase my medical history. The timeline was particularly telling. March 2004 would have been shortly after my 9th birthday, around the time I began asking more pointed questions about my health and the scars I couldn't explain. It was also when Mom started her campaign of dismissing my symptoms as psychological or stress-related. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of anger and betrayal. Every memory of being told I was imagining my symptoms, every dismissal of my legitimate health concerns, every time they had made me feel crazy for questioning their version of events, now felt like a deliberate act of cruelty. But what could possibly motivate parents to hide their child's medical history? What kind of treatment had I received that they felt compelled to conceal? And most importantly, how was I going to get access to information that they had deliberately destroyed? The answers to those questions would require more than phone calls and casual inquiries. I realized I needed professional help, someone with the knowledge and resources to navigate medical databases and hospital systems in ways that I couldn't manage on my own. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a patient advocate recommended by Dr. Reeves. Janet Morris specialized in helping patients access their medical records and navigate complex healthcare bureaucracies. When I explained my situation during our initial consultation, her expression grew increasingly serious. "What you're describing is highly unusual," she said, taking detailed notes. "While parents have the right to maintain custody of their minor children's medical records, deliberately concealing significant medical history from the child can have serious health consequences." She explained that hospitals were required to maintain certain records permanently, particularly for surgical procedures and major treatments. Even if the physical files had been removed, there would be insurance claims, billing records, and administrative documentation that couldn't be easily erased. The challenge, Janet continued, is that accessing these backup systems requires either a court order or cooperation from the institutions involved. However, given your age and the potential health implications, we may be able to make a case for medical necessity. She recommended starting with my insurance records. Since my parents that have filed claims for any significant medical treatment, there would be a paper trail through their insurance company that they couldn't have eliminated. Insurance companies keep detailed records of every claim, every procedure code, every dollar paid out, Janet explained. If you had surgery and ongoing treatment as a child, it will be documented in their system. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. My parents might have been able to retrieve hospital records and destroy physical documents, but they couldn't have erased every trace of my medical history. Insurance databases, billing records, and administrative systems would contain the proof I needed. As I left Janet's office with a list of documents to request and forms to complete, I felt a strange mixture of determination and dread. I was about to uncover truths that my parents had spent decades trying to hide. Whatever I discovered would forever change my understanding of my childhood, my health, and the family I thought I knew. The question that haunted me as I drove home was simple but terrifying. If my medical history was significant enough to warrant this elaborate cover-up, what exactly had been done to me as a child, and why were my own parents so desperate to keep it secret? Following Janet Morris's advice, I began the painstaking process of requesting insurance records from every company my father had worked for during my childhood. The task was more complex than I had anticipated, requiring detailed forms, notarized affidavits, and patient identification numbers I didn't possess. Each insurance provider had different procedures, different waiting periods, and different levels of cooperation. Mountain States Insurance, where Dad had worked from 1995 to 2001, required 3 separate requests before acknowledging they had located my records. The claims specialist, Robert Chen, informed me that their system showed extensive pediatric care for me during that period, but releasing the detailed information would take 4 to 6 weeks due to the age of the records and the need for manual retrieval from archived files. "I can tell you that the claims total was significant," he said during our phone conversation. "Over $40,000 in specialized care between 1998 and 2001 alone. These weren't routine pediatric visits. $40,000? In late 1990s medical costs, that represented major surgical procedures, extended hospital stays, and specialist consultations. The scope of treatment was far beyond anything my parents had ever acknowledged. While waiting for the insurance records, I decided to pursue other avenues of investigation. Janet had suggested contacting medical billing companies that serviced Denver hospitals during the relevant time period. These companies often maintained their own databases independent of hospital systems, and their records might contain details that other sources lacked. I also reached out to my elementary school, hoping their health files might contain information about medical absences or special accommodations. The school district's records department was surprisingly helpful, locating my cumulative file in their long-term storage facility. "Your attendance records are quite unusual," noted Sarah Williams, the records coordinator. "Between kindergarten and third grade, you had extended absences that required home tutoring services. The documentation shows medical exemptions signed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez." Dr. Rodriguez again. The name kept appearing in every avenue of investigation, confirming that she had been my primary physician during the mysterious treatment period. But the mention of home tutoring was new information that added another layer to the concealment. "How long were these absences?" I asked. Sarah reviewed the files carefully, multiple periods of 2 to 3 weeks throughout those years. The district provided a home tutor, Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, who submitted progress reports indicating you were recovering from surgical procedures and unable to attend regular classes. Recovering from surgical procedures, plural. Not a single operation, as Mrs. Davidson had remembered, but multiple surgeries over several years. The magnitude of what had been hidden from me was becoming clearer with each discovery. Armed with this new information, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my parents. Instead of confronting them again with my findings, I chose to conduct a comprehensive investigation without their knowledge. I would gather enough evidence to reconstruct my entire medical history before revealing what I had learned. This decision felt both liberating and terrifying. I was essentially declaring war on the people who had raised me, choosing to trust strangers and official records over the family narrative I had accepted for 28 years. But their reaction to my questions, combined with the mounting evidence of deliberate deception, left me no choice. I took a leave of absence from my job at the marketing firm where I worked as a communications coordinator. Using accumulated vacation time and unpaid leave, I created a 2-month window to focus entirely on uncovering the truth. My supervisor, Amanda Sterling, was understanding when I explained I was dealing with a family medical crisis, though I couldn't provide the details she clearly wanted. With time and resources now dedicated to the investigation, I established a systematic approach. I rented a small office space in downtown Denver, away from my apartment where my parents might unexpectedly visit. I purchased a large whiteboard, filing cabinets, and organized my growing collection of documents, phone numbers, and research notes. My first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Dr. Elena Rodriguez's background, I discovered she had co-authored several medical papers during the early 2000s. One paper, published in the Journal of Pediatric Surgery in 2003, was titled "Long-Term Outcomes in Pediatric Patients with Chronic Inflammatory Bowel Disease Requiring Multiple Surgical Interventions." Reading the abstract, my heart began racing. The paper described a study of children who had undergone complex surgical procedures for severe inflammatory bowel conditions, including bowel resections, stricture repairs, and experimental treatments. The study period was 1998 to 2002, exactly matching my treatment timeline. More importantly, the paper referenced a database of patient outcomes that had been maintained for long-term follow-up studies. If I had been part of this research, there would be detailed records of my condition, treatment, and outcomes stored in the study database. I contacted Dr. Rodriguez's current office at Presbyterian/St. Joseph Hospital, where she had moved after leaving Denver Children's Medical Center. Her research coordinator, Dr. Michael Patterson, agreed to meet with me after I explained my situation and provided my identification. "I need to be very careful about patient confidentiality," Dr. Patterson explained during our meeting in his cramped office surrounded by medical journals and research files. "But if you were indeed a patient in Dr. Rodriguez's study and you're requesting your own medical information, we may be able to help." He accessed the research database using my name and birth date. His expression changed as he reviewed the information on his screen. "You were definitely a study participant," he said slowly. "The records are quite extensive, but I'm seeing some unusual notations here." "What kind of notations?" Dr. Patterson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "The file indicates that parental consent for long-term follow-up was withdrawn in 2004. Additionally, there's a note that all study materials related to this patient were to be sealed and not used in any publications or presentations." "What does that mean?" "It means your parents specifically requested that your case be excluded from any research outcomes, and they declined participation in follow-up studies that were designed to track your long-term health." He paused, studying the screen more carefully. "This is highly unusual. Most parents want their children included in follow-up research because it provides free monitoring of their condition." Dr. Patterson was able to provide me with basic information about my participation in the study, though he couldn't release detailed medical records without proper authorization. However, he confirmed that I had been diagnosed with a severe form of Crohn's disease at age 5, requiring multiple surgeries to remove damaged sections of my intestine. "Crohn's disease is a chronic condition," he explained. "It doesn't just disappear after surgery. Patients typically require lifelong monitoring and treatment to prevent complications." "What happens if it goes untreated?" His expression became grave. "Untreated Crohn's can lead to serious complications, intestinal blockages, malnutrition, increased cancer risk, and systemic inflammation that affects other organs. The symptoms you described in your initial inquiry, joint pain, fatigue, digestive issues, these are all consistent with active Crohn's disease." The pieces were finally falling into place. I had been diagnosed with a serious chronic illness as a child, undergone multiple surgeries, and then my parents had deliberately concealed this information and prevented me from receiving ongoing medical care. Their insistence that my symptoms were psychological or stress-related had been a knowing lie. But understanding the medical facts only raised more disturbing questions. Why would parents hide a child's chronic illness? What could possibly motivate them to prevent necessary medical treatment? And how long had they planned to maintain this deception? I spent the next 2 weeks documenting everything I had learned, creating a comprehensive timeline of my childhood medical treatment and the subsequent cover-up. The evidence was overwhelming. Insurance claims totaling tens of thousands of dollars, school records documenting extended medical absences, hospital databases confirming surgical procedures, and research participation in a study for serious pediatric illness. Janet Morris reviewed my findings during a follow-up meeting, her expression growing increasingly serious as she studied the documentation. "This is more than just hiding medical records," she said finally. "By preventing you from receiving follow-up care for a chronic condition, your parents may have committed medical neglect. The fact that you're now experiencing complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment makes this potentially actionable." She recommended consulting with both a medical malpractice attorney and a family law specialist who could advise me on the legal implications of what I had discovered. She also suggested obtaining a court order that would compel the release of all remaining medical records, ensuring I could get complete information about my treatment history. But before taking legal action, I needed to make one final attempt to get answers directly from my parents. Armed with irrefutable evidence of their deception, I planned a confrontation that would force them to explain their actions and provide me with the complete truth about my medical history. As I prepared for this conversation, I realized that regardless of their explanations, my relationship with my parents would never be the same. They had stolen decades of my life by hiding a medical condition that required ongoing care. Their deception had directly contributed to my current health problems and could have cost me my life. The question that haunted me as I prepared for this final confrontation was whether their motives had been misguided protection or something far more sinister. Either way, I was about to demand answers that would finally expose the truth they had spent 24 years trying to hide. I chose Thanksgiving weekend for the confrontation, calculating that my parents would be relaxed and my siblings would be present as witnesses. I had prepared meticulously, organizing all my evidence into a presentation folder: insurance claims documentation, school records, hospital database confirmations, and Dr. Patterson's written summary of my participation in the Crohn's disease study. The drive to my parents' house felt surreal. I had made this journey hundreds of times over the years, but never with the intention of fundamentally destroying the family dynamic. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I rehearsed different approaches, trying to find words that could adequately express my anger and betrayal while still allowing for some possibility of explanation or redemption. Marcus and Emma had already arrived when I pulled into the familiar driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mom preparing her traditional Thanksgiving feast while Dad watched football in the living room. The picture of domestic normalcy felt like a mockery given what I now knew about their capacity for deception. I waited until after dinner when we were all gathered in the living room with coffee and leftover pie. The setting felt appropriate for major family announcements, though no one expected what was coming. "I need to discuss something important with all of you," I began, pulling out my evidence folder. Dad's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and Mom's expression immediately shifted from relaxed contentment to wary alertness. Marcus and Emma looked curious, unaware of what was coming. "I know about Crohn's disease," I continued, watching their faces carefully. "I know about Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the multiple surgeries, the 3 years of treatment, and the $40,000 in insurance claims." The silence that followed was absolute. Dad set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, while Mom's face had gone completely white. Marcus looked confused, glancing between our parents and me, while Emma's expression showed dawning recognition. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Dad said finally, his voice controlled but strained, "but you're clearly misunderstanding some old paperwork." I opened the folder and began laying documents on the coffee table systematically. Insurance claims from Mountain States Insurance showing extensive pediatric gastroenterology treatment, school records documenting medical absences for surgical recovery, database records from Presbyterian Hospital confirming my participation in Dr. Rodriguez's research study. With each piece of evidence, Mom seemed to shrink further into her chair. Dad's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching, but he maintained his facade of controlled denial. "And this," I said, placing Dr. Patterson's summary on top of the pile, "is a written confirmation from Dr. Rodriguez's research coordinator that I was diagnosed with severe Crohn's disease at age 5 and underwent multiple bowel resection surgeries between 1998 and 2001. Marcus stood up abruptly, moving to examine the documents. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, looking at our parents. "Kayla had Crohn's disease? Why didn't we know about this?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, are these real?" The facade finally cracked. Mom began crying, her hands covering her face as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Dad's composure held for another moment before he exploded. "You had no right to go digging into private family matters," he shouted, standing up and pointing at me accusingly. "What we did to protect you." "Protect me?" I shot back, my own voice rising. "Protect me from what? Medical care? Knowledge about my own body? Treatment for a chronic illness that's been destroying my health for years?" "You don't understand the situation," Mom said through her tears. "You were so young, and the treatments were so traumatic. The doctors wanted to put you on immunosuppressive drugs that could have caused cancer. They wanted to monitor you constantly, run tests every few months, treat you like a sick child for the rest of your life." "Because I am sick," I screamed, startling everyone in the room. "I've been sick this entire time, and you convinced me it was all in my head." Dad moved closer, his voice dropping to a threatening tone I had never heard before. "We made the decision we thought was best. You were responding well to the surgeries. Dr. Rodriguez said there was a chance you could outgrow the condition. We wanted you to have a normal childhood instead of growing up in hospitals." "That wasn't your decision to make," I said, standing to face him. "And I didn't outgrow it. The symptoms never stopped. I've been suffering for 20 years while you told me I was imagining things." Marcus was reading through the insurance documents, his expression growing increasingly angry. "These aren't small procedures," he said, looking up at our parents. "Bowel resections, stricter repairs, experimental drug trials. This is a major medical treatment." Emma had picked up the school records, studying the documented absences. Home tutoring for 3 weeks at a time, multiple times per year? How did we not remember this? You were very young, Mom said defensively. We told you Kayla had the flu or minor infections. We didn't want you to be scared or worried about your sister. So you lied to all of us? Marcus said flatly. For 24 years, you've been lying to your entire family? The confrontation escalated rapidly from there. Dad accused me of being ungrateful and disrespectful, insisting they had saved me from a lifetime of medical trauma. Mom alternated between tearful apologies and defensive justifications, claiming they had only wanted what was best for me. But their explanations fell apart under scrutiny. When I pressed them about withdrawing consent from the research study and sealing my medical records, they became evasive. When I asked why they had prevented routine follow-up care that could have monitored my condition, they had no coherent answer. The doctors said you might need ongoing treatment, Dad finally admitted, but they also said there was a possibility you wouldn't. We decided to give you a chance at a normal life instead of subjecting you to constant medical intervention. Without asking me, I pointed out, without even telling me what condition I had so I could make informed decisions about my own health. You were a child, Mom protested. Children don't make medical decisions. I stopped being a child 18 years ago, I replied coldly, and you've continued lying to me as an adult, even when I came to you with serious health problems that you knew were related to my condition. The argument continued for hours, growing more heated and destructive as the evening wore on. Marcus and Emma initially tried to mediate, but eventually took sides, both expressing outrage at our parents' deception. The family unity that had defined our household for decades was crumbling in real time. By midnight, the conversation had devolved into accusations, recriminations, and threats. Dad warned me that pursuing legal action would destroy the family permanently. Mom begged me to consider their perspective, to understand the impossible position they had been placed in as young parents facing their child's serious illness. But their appeals for understanding rang hollow. They had stolen my agency, my health, and my right to make informed decisions about my own medical care. Their fear of my condition had led them to create an elaborate deception that has caused far more harm than the truth ever could have. The evening ended with me gathering my evidence and walking out of the house where I had grown up, uncertain if I would ever return. Marcus followed me to my car, expressing his support and promising to help me get any additional information I might need. Emma remained inside, trying to comfort our distraught parents. "I can't believe they did this to you," Marcus said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I keep thinking about all the times you complained about being tired or having stomach problems, and they just dismissed it." "The worst part," I replied, "is that they convinced me it was all psychological. I've spent years thinking I was weak or neurotic instead of understanding that I had a legitimate medical condition." As I drove home through the empty streets, the adrenaline from the confrontation began wearing off, replaced by a profound sense of loss. I had finally gotten answers, but at the cost of any possibility of normal family relationships. The people who were supposed to protect and care for me had instead chosen to endanger my health through willful ignorance. But alongside the grief and anger, I felt something else. After decades of doubt and confusion, I finally understood what was wrong with my health. I had a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and the knowledge I needed to take control of my medical care. The next challenge would be rebuilding my health while navigating the legal and emotional aftermath of my family's deception. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt equipped to face whatever came next, armed with the truth they had tried so desperately to hide. "Your Crohn's disease has been progressing unchecked," Dr. Hernandez explained during our follow-up appointment. "The joint pain, fatigue, and digestive issues you've been experiencing are all manifestations of systemic inflammation. Without treatment, this condition has been affecting your entire body." But there was also encouraging news. Modern treatments for Crohn's disease had advanced significantly since my childhood surgeries. Targeted biologic medications could control inflammation more effectively than the drugs available in the late 1990s, potentially preventing further damage and improving my quality of life dramatically. "We can't undo the years of progression," Dr. Hernandez said, "but we can absolutely get your condition under control and help you feel better than you have in decades." Starting treatment felt like awakening from a long, confusing dream. Within 6 weeks of beginning biologic therapy, the chronic fatigue that had plagued me for years began lifting. The joint pain that had made simple tasks difficult started subsiding. For the first time since childhood, I began experiencing what normal energy levels felt like. The psychological impact was equally profound. Suddenly having medical validation for symptoms I had been told were imaginary was both liberating and infuriating. I started therapy with Dr. Rebecca Santos, a psychologist who specialized in medical trauma and family dysfunction. What your parents did constitutes a form of medical gaslighting, Dr. Santos explained during one of our early sessions. They convinced you to distrust your own physical experiences, which can have lasting effects on your ability to advocate for yourself and trust your instincts. Through therapy, I began understanding how deeply the deception had affected my self-perception. I had internalized my parents' narrative that I was weak, overly sensitive, and prone to imagining problems. Learning to trust my own body and emotions again required conscious effort and professional guidance. Meanwhile, Marcus had become an unexpected ally in my quest for complete medical records. As a physical therapist, he understood the importance of comprehensive medical history and was appalled by our parents' actions. He used his professional connections to help me locate additional documentation and identify specialists who might have been involved in my childhood care. "I found something," he told me during a coffee meeting in early January. "Remember Dr. Phillips, the pediatric psychologist you saw briefly when you were 7? I tracked him down through the state licensing board." Dr. Richard Phillips was now retired, but maintained detailed personal records of his former patients. When Marcus contacted him, explaining our situation, Dr. Phillips agreed to meet with me privately. "I remember your case very clearly," Dr. Phillips said when we met at his former office, now converted to a coffee shop. "Your parents brought you to me because they were concerned about your reaction to the medical treatments you were receiving." He pulled out a worn folder containing his handwritten notes from our sessions. "You were struggling with medical anxiety, which was completely normal for a child undergoing repeated surgeries. But your parents seemed more focused on helping you forget about your medical condition than on processing the trauma of what you had experienced." Dr. Phillips's notes painted a disturbing picture of my parents' mindset during my treatment. They had specifically asked him to help me stop talking about my illness, stop asking questions about my condition, and essentially dissociate from my medical experiences. "I recommended family therapy to help everyone process the diagnosis together," he continued. "But your parents were resistant. They wanted individual treatment focused on helping you move past your illness rather than learning to manage it." After only 4 sessions, my parents had withdrawn me from therapy, claiming I was doing better and no longer needed psychological support. Dr. Phillips had noted his concerns about this decision in his final summary. "In my professional opinion," he said, looking directly at me, "your parents were struggling with their own trauma about your diagnosis. Rather than processing their fears and grief, they chose denial and avoidance, which ultimately harmed your long-term well-being." This revelation added another layer to my understanding of my parents' motivation. They weren't just protecting me from medical trauma, they were protecting themselves from having to face their child's chronic illness. While gathering this additional evidence, I was also pursuing legal action with the help of attorney Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in medical malpractice and patient rights cases. Jennifer reviewed all my documentation and concluded that while pursuing malpractice claims against the hospitals would be difficult due to the statute of limitations, there were grounds for other legal actions. "Your parents' actions constitute a pattern of medical neglect and potentially fraudulent concealment of medical information," she explained. "More importantly, their withdrawal of consent from follow-up care while knowing you had a chronic condition could be considered child endangerment." Jennifer recommended filing complaints with the state medical board regarding the handling of my case and pursuing civil action to recover the costs of my current medical treatment, which could be directly attributed to the years of neglect. But beyond the legal implications, I was discovering unexpected strength in advocating for myself. The process of investigating my medical history, confronting my parents, and taking control of my healthcare had revealed capabilities I never knew I possessed. I was more determined, more assertive, and more confident than I had ever been. This newfound strength extended beyond medical advocacy. At work, I began speaking up in meetings, proposing new projects, and positioning myself for promotions I would never have considered before. In personal relationships, I established clearer boundaries and stopped accepting treatment that didn't respect my needs and perspectives. Emma, who had initially been torn between supporting me and maintaining family unity, gradually became another strong ally. During a long phone conversation in February, she made a confession that surprised me. "I've been doing my own research," she said, "about Crohn's disease, about the treatments you should have been receiving, about what could have happened if your condition had been properly managed." She had consulted with professors in her biochemistry program who specialized in autoimmune disorders. Their feedback had convinced her that our parents' actions were not just misguided, but potentially criminal in their negligence. "They're still trying to convince me that they did the right thing," Emma continued, "but the science doesn't support their decision. You could have died from complications, Kayla. Untreated Crohn's disease can be fatal." Her academic validation of my experience was particularly meaningful. Emma had always been the family intellectual, the one whose opinions carried weight in academic and scientific matters. Having her confirm that my parents' actions were medically indefensible helped counter their ongoing attempts to justify their deception. By March, I had assembled a comprehensive case file documenting not just my medical history, but the systematic pattern of concealment and neglect that had characterized my parents' approach to my health care. The evidence was overwhelming, spanning multiple institutions, medical professionals, and time periods. But perhaps more importantly, I had assembled a new support network of medical professionals, legal advocates, and family members who validated my experiences and supported my efforts to reclaim my health and autonomy. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly empowered to make decisions about my own well-being. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the improvement in my health was dramatic. It was psychological, emotional, and social. I was becoming the person I might have been if I had grown up with knowledge of my condition and agency in my medical care. As spring arrived in Denver, I realized I had not just uncovered a medical conspiracy, I had fundamentally changed my relationship with myself, my family, and my future. The scared, confused young woman who had begun this investigation 6 months earlier was evolving into someone stronger, more confident, and more determined to live life on her own terms. The question now was how to use this newfound strength and knowledge to not just heal my own wounds, but potentially help others who might be facing similar situations of medical gaslighting and family deception. The breakthrough moment came in April, during what should have been a routine follow-up appointment with Dr. Hernandez. She had been reviewing my latest test results when she paused, studying something on her computer screen with unusual intensity. "Kayla, I need to ask you something important," she said, turning to face me directly. "Have you considered sharing your story publicly? What happened to you represents a significant case study in medical advocacy and patient rights." She explained that she had been following my case not just as my physician, but as someone who served on the Colorado Medical Board's Patient Advocacy Committee. My situation had implications that extended far beyond personal justice. It highlighted systemic issues in pediatric care, parental medical decision-making, and the long-term consequences of medical concealment. "Cases like yours are more common than people realize," Dr. Hernandez continued. "There are patients throughout the healthcare system who have been denied access to their own medical histories, often by well-meaning family members who think they're providing protection." She had already begun discussing my case in professional circles, with my permission, as an example of the importance of patient autonomy and medical transparency. The response from her colleagues had been significant enough that she believed my story could influence policy changes at institutional and state levels. Would you be interested in presenting your experience at the Colorado Medical Association's annual conference? They're specifically looking for patient advocacy cases that demonstrate the need for stronger protections of medical information access. The invitation was both flattering and terrifying. Speaking publicly about my experience would mean exposing my family's dysfunction to professional scrutiny and potentially media attention. But it would also provide a platform to prevent similar situations from happening to other patients. I agreed to consider the opportunity, and Dr. Hernandez connected me with Dr. Amanda Foster, the conference coordinator who specialized in patient rights presentations. Dr. Foster was immediately interested in my case, particularly the documentation I had assembled proving the systematic concealment of medical information. "Your evidence is exceptionally comprehensive," Dr. Foster said during our initial meeting. "Most patients who experience medical gaslighting or concealment don't have the resources or persistence to document their cases thoroughly. Your story could be incredibly powerful in demonstrating both the problem and the solution." While preparing for the potential speaking engagement, I received unexpected validation from another source. Jennifer Walsh, my attorney, had filed formal complaints with both the Colorado Medical Board and the State Department of Health regarding the handling of my case. The responses exceeded our expectations. The medical board launched a formal investigation into the policies and procedures that had allowed my parents to remove and conceal comprehensive medical records. Their preliminary findings suggested that Denver Children's Medical Center had not followed proper protocols for ensuring patient access to medical information, even when requested by parents. The hospital should have maintained duplicate records, the investigating officer Sarah Martinez explained during our interview. Even when parents request physical files, institutions are required to preserve digital copies and ensure future access for the patient. More significantly, the investigation revealed that several other patients had experienced similar issues at Denver Children's Medical Center during the same time period. My case had exposed a pattern of inadequate record-keeping and insufficient protection of patient rights that affected multiple families. The Department of Health investigation focused on the broader implications of parental medical decision-making and its impact on children's long-term health care. Their report, which would be released publicly, cited my case as a primary example of how well-intentioned parental choices could result in serious medical neglect. "Your willingness to come forward has likely prevented other patients from experiencing similar harm," Sarah Martinez told me. "The policy changes resulting from this investigation will strengthen protections for all pediatric patients." The institutional recognition was validating, but the personal acknowledgments were equally meaningful. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, my childhood surgeon, reached out through Dr. Patterson to express her regret about how my case had been handled. "I remember you very clearly," she wrote in a personal letter. "You were a brave little girl who handled difficult treatments with remarkable resilience. I was concerned when your parents withdrew you from follow-up care, but I was told they were seeking treatment elsewhere." She revealed that she had attempted to contact my parents several times in the years following my last appointment, recommending routine monitoring and expressing concern about my condition. They had never responded to her outreach efforts. "If I had known they were concealing your diagnosis from you as an adult, I would have taken stronger action," she continued. "Please know that your case has changed how I approach parental involvement in pediatric medical decisions." Dr. Rodriguez offered to provide any additional medical records or testimony that might be helpful for my legal case or advocacy efforts. Her support, from the physician who had literally saved my life as a child, was profoundly meaningful. The validation extended beyond medical professionals. Marcus had shared my story with colleagues in his physical therapy practice, many of whom worked with chronic illness patients. Their responses highlighted how common medical gaslighting and family concealment actually were in healthcare settings. "3 of my colleagues have similar stories," Marcus told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Not as extreme as yours, but cases where family members concealed or minimized medical information that affected their long-term care." One of his colleagues, a physical therapist named David Kim, had experienced a less severe but similarly troubling situation. His parents had concealed his childhood diagnosis of scoliosis, leading to years of back pain that could have been prevented with proper treatment and monitoring. "Your courage in pursuing this is inspiring other people to examine their own medical histories," Marcus explained. "David is now working with his doctors to address spinal issues that should have been managed decades ago." Emma's support had evolved from reluctant acceptance to active advocacy. She had begun incorporating lessons from my experience into her biochemistry research, focusing on patient communication and medical transparency in clinical studies. "Your case is being discussed in my graduate seminars," she told me during a visit to Denver. "Professors are using it as an example of why patient consent and communication protocols are so crucial in medical research." She had also confronted our parents more directly than I had expected, demanding explanations for their actions and expressing her disappointment in their choices. Her academic credibility gave her opinions weight that they couldn't easily dismiss. Mom cried when I showed her the research about untreated Crohn's complications, Emma said. I think she's finally understanding the severity of what they did, even if Dad is still defensive. The recognition from professional, institutional, and personal sources created a momentum that extended beyond my individual case. By May, I had received invitations to speak at 3 different medical conferences, participate in a patient advocacy panel discussion, and contribute to a research paper about medical gaslighting in family settings. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source: other patients who had heard about my case through various channels. Dr. Hernandez began referring patients who had experienced medical concealment or gaslighting to speak with me, and their stories reinforced both the significance of my experience and the importance of sharing it publicly. Lisa Chen, a 35-year-old teacher, had spent 20 years believing she was prone to anxiety and depression before discovering that her parents had concealed her childhood diagnosis of a thyroid condition. Without proper treatment, her unmanaged thyroid disorder had caused decades of symptoms that were dismissed as psychological problems. Michael Rodriguez, a 42-year-old engineer, learned at age 40 that his parents had hidden his childhood diagnosis of a bleeding disorder, leading to years of unexplained fatigue and medical complications that could have been prevented with proper monitoring. Talking to you helped me understand that I wasn't crazy for feeling like something was wrong, Lisa told me during one of our conversations. Your advocacy gave me the courage to demand my complete medical records and get proper treatment. These connections with other affected patients solidified my decision to speak publicly about my experience. If my story could help even one person avoid decades of unnecessary suffering, the discomfort of public exposure would be worthwhile. As spring turned to summer, I found myself at the center of a growing movement focused on patient rights, medical transparency, and the long-term consequences of healthcare concealment. What had begun as a personal quest for medical answers had evolved into a platform for systemic change that could benefit countless other patients. The recognition and validation I was receiving from medical professionals, institutions, and fellow patients provided confirmation that my decision to pursue the truth had been not just personally necessary, but socially valuable. I was no longer just recovering from my own medical trauma, I was helping to prevent others from experiencing similar harm. 1 year after that devastating Thanksgiving confrontation, I stood at the podium of the Colorado Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 medical professionals gathered for the Colorado Medical Association's annual conference. The presentation I was about to deliver, titled "When Families Become Barriers: A Case Study in Medical Concealment and Patient Advocacy," represented the culmination of everything I had learned about my health, my family, and my own strength. Medical records don't lie, I began, clicking to my first slide, which displayed the timeline of my hidden childhood treatment. But families sometimes do. The presentation went beyond my personal story to outline the systemic changes that had emerged from my case. Denver Children's Medical Center had implemented new protocols requiring permanent digital preservation of all patient records, regardless of parental requests for physical file removal. The Colorado Medical Board had established clearer guidelines for patient access to medical information, and the Department of Health had issued new recommendations for handling cases where parents might be concealing medical information from adult children. But the most significant outcome was the establishment of the Colorado Patient Medical History Access Program, a state initiative that helps adult patients locate and obtain their complete medical records when family members have concealed or destroyed documentation. The program, partly inspired by my case, had already assisted over 200 patients in accessing previously hidden medical information. During the question and answer session following my presentation, a pediatrician from Grand Junction raised her hand. "Dr. Thompson," she said, using the honorary title the conference had bestowed upon me, "how do you balance respecting parental medical decision-making with protecting children's long-term healthcare interests?" It was a question I had grappled with extensively during my advocacy work. I believe parents have the right and responsibility to make medical decisions for their minor children, I responded. But those decisions should be based on medical evidence and professional recommendations, not on fear or denial. And crucially, when children become adults, they have an absolute right to access their complete medical history. The audience's response was overwhelmingly positive, with several physicians approaching me afterward to discuss similar cases they had encountered in their practices. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a pediatric gastroenterologist from Phoenix, shared that my presentation had convinced her to implement new protocols in her practice for ensuring adult patients could always access their childhood medical records. Your story illustrates why we need to think about long-term patient advocacy, not just immediate treatment, she said. Thank you for having this public. The legal resolution of my case had been equally significant. Jennifer Walsh had successfully negotiated a settlement with Denver Children's Medical Center that included financial compensation for my medical expenses and a formal acknowledgement that their record-keeping procedures had been inadequate. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring the hospital to maintain comprehensive digital records and provide clearer access procedures for adult patients seeking their medical histories. My parents had initially resisted participating in any legal proceedings, maintaining their position that they had acted in my best interests. However, as the evidence mounted and the professional consensus against their actions became clear, they eventually agreed to participate in family mediation sessions. The mediation process, facilitated by Dr. Santos and a family law specialist, had been emotionally exhausting but ultimately necessary. Over the course of 6 months, we worked through decades of dysfunction, miscommunication, and betrayal. I need you to understand, I told them during one particularly difficult session, that your decision to hide my medical condition wasn't just about my childhood. It affected every day of my adult life. Every time I felt sick and you told me it was in my head, you were choosing your comfort over my health. The breakthrough came when Mom finally acknowledged the full scope of the harm their decisions had caused. We were young parents dealing with a terrifying diagnosis, she said through tears. We thought if we could make the illness go away by not talking about it, you could have a normal life. We were wrong. Dad's acknowledgement was more reluctant but equally important. I spent 24 years convinced we had made the right choice, he admitted. Seeing what you've accomplished in advocating for yourself and other patients, I realized we robbed you of the chance to be strong and informed about your own health from the beginning. The family healing process was ongoing and imperfect. While we had re-established contact and were working toward rebuilding our relationships, trust would take years to fully restore. But the mediation had created a foundation for honest communication that hadn't existed before. Marcus and Emma had both become allies in my advocacy work. Marcus used his physical therapy practice to identify and refer patients who might be experiencing medical concealment, while Emma incorporated patient advocacy principles into her biochemistry research. Our sibling relationships, freed from the toxic dynamic of hidden family secrets, had grown stronger and more authentic. My health transformation had been equally dramatic. Under Dr. Hernandez's care, my Crohn's disease was well controlled for the first time in decades. The biologic medication had eliminated most of my symptoms, and regular monitoring ensured that any flares could be addressed immediately. My energy levels, digestive function, and overall quality of life had improved so significantly that I felt like I was experiencing true health for the first time in my adult life. You're essentially a different person physiologically, Dr. Hernandez told me during my 1-year follow-up appointment. Your inflammatory markers are normal, your nutritional status is excellent, and your overall health indicators are those of someone who has never had poorly controlled chronic illness. But the changes extended far beyond my physical health. The confidence I had gained through advocating for myself had transformed every aspect of my life. At work, I was promoted to Senior Communications Director, largely based on my demonstrated ability to research complex issues, present compelling arguments, and advocate for important causes. I had also started a relationship with Dr. James Mitchell, a psychiatrist who specialized in medical trauma, whom I had met through my advocacy work. Our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect for the complexity of medical and psychological healing, and he understood firsthand the challenges of rebuilding trust after medical gaslighting. What I admire most about you, James told me during one of our early dates, is that you took something traumatic and devastating and transformed it into a force for positive change. You didn't just heal yourself, you're helping heal a broken system. The patient advocacy work had become a central part of my identity. I had established the Medical Truth Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping patients access concealed medical information and providing support for those who had experienced medical gaslighting. The foundation had already assisted over 150 patients in uncovering medical histories and accessing appropriate care. One of our most successful cases involved helping a 45-year-old woman named Patricia Williams discover that her chronic fatigue and joint pain were actually symptoms of lupus that had been diagnosed but concealed by her parents when she was a teenager. Like me, Patricia had spent decades believing her symptoms were psychological, when proper treatment could have prevented years of suffering and organ damage. The Medical Truth Foundation saved my life, Patricia said during our foundation's first annual fundraising event. Kayla's courage in sharing her story gave me the strength to demand my medical records and get the treatment I needed. These success stories reinforced my conviction that my traumatic experience had ultimately served a greater purpose. The suffering I had endured due to my parents' deception had been transformed into a tool for preventing similar harm to others. Looking back on the journey from that Christmas morning when I had felt invisible and overlooked to standing before medical professionals as an advocate for patient rights, I realized that my parents' attempt to hide my medical condition had inadvertently led to my greatest personal growth and most meaningful professional contribution. The book they had given me that Christmas had been titled How to Grow Up, and in a way, their well-meaning but misguided gift had indeed taught me how to grow up, just not in the way they had intended. Growing up has meant learning to trust my own experiences, advocate for my own needs, and refuse to accept others' definitions of my reality. It had meant having the courage to pursue uncomfortable truths, even when those truths threatened the stability of my family relationships. It had meant developing the strength to stand up to people I loved when their actions were harmful, regardless of their intentions. Most importantly, it means recognizing that true healing comes not from hiding from difficult realities, but facing them with courage, seeking support from others, and using our experiences to create positive change in the world. The medical records that my parents had tried so desperately to destroy had ultimately led to the preservation of countless other patients' rights to access their own medical information. The illness they had attempted to hide had become the foundation for advocacy work that was improving healthcare systems across the country. As I concluded my presentation at the medical conference that day, I shared the lesson that had emerged from my journey. Medical truth may be uncomfortable, but medical deception is always harmful. Our responsibility as healthcare providers, as patients, and as family members is to choose courage over comfort, transparency over protection, and empowerment over control. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of my personal story, it was acknowledgement of the universal importance of medical truth, patient advocacy, and the healing power of speaking difficult truths with courage and compassion. My parents had given me a book about growing up, but life had taught me that true maturity comes from facing reality with courage, using our experiences to help others, and never allowing fear to silence the truth that could set us free. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.